Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies, and this is our first seminar, our traditional Friday seminar series, which unfortunately I am in the Boston area right now. I'm Tufts University was gracious enough to let me have a room to do this right now, and I'm really sorry that I cannot be there with you in person, but I guess we have become a bit more deft at using all these technologies and trying to figure out how to do these things remotely. So kindly note that the webinar is being live streamed, and it will continue to be public on our class YouTube page after the event. Please do submit any questions or comments through the YouTube chat to Professor Saldaña Portillo, and we will make sure that those questions get transmitted to her in the Q&A session. And I do remind all of us who are here in the Stanford, all of you who are in the Stanford territories, that Stanford sits in the land of the Ohlone peoples, the Ohlone territories. I am so sorry, but I have just lost all my script. Can you help me with the land acknowledgement, please, on the other end? I am so sorry, I have lost the script.
Yes, one moment. Thank you, Alberto.
Should I read it? ¿Dónde me pongo? So we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples, and we offer gratitude to the land, water, and air that surround us and pay our respects to the past, present, and future Ohlone and the Napi peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas.
Yeah, I am sorry, but I cannot get the screen to show me Josie's bio either. So, so please, Elizabeth Sainz-Ackerman, our associate.
I can introduce myself. It's my pleasure.
Feeling for me and present our speaker, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. It is my pleasure today to introduce Professor María Josefina Saldaña Portillo. She is professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis Department and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. Her book, Indian Given Racial Geographies Across Mexico and the United States, received the 2019 Casa de las Américas Literary Prize in Latino Studies, the 2017 ASA John Cobb Franklin Book Prize, and the 2017 Max Book Award, with 30 articles in English and Spanish on revolution, subaltern politics, indigenous peoples, racial formation, migration, narcoeconomies, and Latin American and Latinx cultural studies. Her most recent include Indians Have Always Been Modern, Roma, the Settler Colonial Paradigm, and Latinx Temporality, which rethinks the colonialism from a Latin American perspective and the violence of citizenship in the making of refugees, the US and Central America, which explores the integral role gender, labor, and violence play in the drug economy. She is currently the Latin American Studies Association treasurer, chairwoman of the Coalición Mexicana, an immigrants' rights organization, and an expert witness for Central American asylum cases with legal aid agencies internationally. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much, Alberto, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, both of you for inviting me here, and the Stanford Center for Latin American Studies for hosting me, Sara and Megan Bonilla for helping to organize the logistics, and all of you for being here in person, and those of you who are virtual. So 20 years ago, I published Who is the Indian in Aztlán? Rewriting Mestizaje, Indianism, and Chicanismo from the Lacandon, an essay that initiated a critique of Mestizaje for the ways in which it placed indigenous peoples and indigeneity under erasure. within Chicanx aesthetics and scholarship. I revisit my critique today, not as an empty gesture of commemoration, but because the last 20 years of scholarship and migration patterns makes revisiting Mestizaje necessary. Since the publication of Who is the Indian in Aztlán in 2001, we have seen the rise to prominence of the white settler colonial paradigm within US Native American and Indigenous studies and American studies more broadly. This has coincided with the largest influx of indigenous migrants from Mexico since the 1920s and 30s. Researching my second book, Indian Given, during this period of 20 years between this and my first essay, also made me aware of the history of legislation requiring annexed Mexicans and subsequent Mexican immigrants to give up all ties to their indigenous and African heritage in order to become US citizens. When I wrote Who's the Indian in Aztlán, I was conducting fieldwork for my first book, The Revolutionary Imagination in the Americas, among Zapatistas in Chiapas, while researching the impact of the Mexican Revolution on the indigenous peasantry. With their political and economic demands, the Zapatistas challenged the Mestizaje indigenismo dyad at the heart of revolutionary biopolitics. Consequently, my critique of Mestizaje was laser focused on its political function as a tool for managing an ethnically and racially diverse population after the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Mestizaje, as a model for revolutionary citizenship, gave all Mexicans claim to indigenous ancestry and belonging in the nation, regardless of their class, ethnicity, or race, while relegating indigenous people into a subordinate role within Mexico's developmentalist agenda, one that included land reform, universal education, and healthcare, benefiting indigenous peoples considerably, but that also established the National Indigenous Institute, geared to the rehabilitation of indigenous peoples and their cultures. Thus, Mestizaje operated as a biopolitical tool for managing the life of Mexico's indigenous population within the nation. It's from this vantage point that I first recognized that Mestizaje had played a similar, though not identical, role within the Chicano movement, its aesthetics and academic production. Mestizaje united Mexican Americans, diverse in class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender identifications, for Chicano nationalism by universalizing ancestral claims to the U.S. Southwest, Aztlán, through a shared, if tenuous, indigenous past. Mestizaje provided the rationale for Chicanismo's claim to symbolic sovereignty over Aztlán, and thus enabled a form of indigenous appropriation that necessarily placed living indigenous peoples and sovereignty under erasure. This erasure sustained myths of indigenous belonging for Chicanx artists, activists, and scholars for whom political sovereignty is foreclosed within the United States. The indigenismo accessed through Mestizaje by canonical authors like Gloria Anzaldúa and Richard Rodriguez, whose texts I analyzed in my 2001 essay, ultimately did not escape the logic of indigenous erasure. However much Anzaldúa and Rodriguez revised the aesthetic tropes of the dyad, Aztlán nationalism and indigenous appropriation impinged on the sovereignty of real living indigenous peoples. The essay inspired a paradigmatic shift in the approach to Mestizaje within Chicanx aesthetics and scholarship that, among other things, helped foment a fertile interface between Native American and Indigenous studies and Latinx and Chicanx studies by providing vital recognition for the Native American scholars of the indigenous appropriation at the heart of Chicano Mestizaje. Two things strike me upon rereading my essay, as 20 years highlights new dimensions to my critique and necessarily its limits. Firstly, I failed to appreciate the psychic pain of racism and loss registered in Anzaldúa and Rodriguez's memoirs, and accordingly, the role Mestizaje played in psychic reparations. I stand by my essay's argument that Anzaldua's mestiza consciousness was a form of romanticized appropriation of indigeneity. However, teaching Anzaldua all of these years has taught me how powerfully her writing speaks to bi and multiracial students through the trope of mestizaje, not just to Chicanx students. As Amelia Sawada argues in her forthcoming manuscript, mestizaje enabled biracial queer subjects of the Pacific Southwest to recognize themselves in mestizaje's mutant anti-colonial possibilities. Secondly, I'm convinced that my use of the term erasure rather than elimination to describe how mestizaje constrains indigenous life as a form of biopower was correct. Putting indigeneity under erasure is philosophically a crossing out but leaving in place. Mestizaje does not eliminate indigeneity or indigenous peoples. Rather, it subordinates indigenous peoples while nevertheless preserving them because of the vital work they do for the nation. In a Derridian sense, erasure underscores the mutually constituting aspect of mestizaje and indigeneity, each term relying on the other's difference for meaning. The term elimination, so prominent within the white settler colonial paradigm today, was not available to me in 2001. Though Patrick Wolfe published his treatise on white settler colonialism in 1999, it took a decade for the paradigm to disseminate broadly. In White Man's Flower, Wolfe argued that the degree of miscegenation in Anglophone colonial societies like Australia was so numerically overwhelming to white settlers that they absorbed mixed-race peoples into their settler ranks, effectively eliminating indigenous peoples in the process. Despite Wolfe explicitly stating that miscegenation operated differently in Latin America, subsequent settler colonial scholars insist that mestizaje is nothing more than a form of native elimination, often citing my essay in support of this argument. I continue to hold that mestizaje is the method of managing the continuation of indigenous life in Latin America, not its elimination. This is more than an academic quibble, as pedagogically, culturally, aesthetically, and existentially, mestizaje continues to generate meaning in excess of its biopower, as does indigenismo, the other term of the dyad. Mestizaje signifies indigenous erasure, but also makes available forms of recognition and redress in indigenismo. As Zapotec literary scholar Lourdes Alberto has suggested, there is a, quote, mestizaje desde abajo, end quote, employed by indigenous subjects as a mechanism of recognition. I revisit mestizaje in my talk today to see if it can indeed be resignified for the purposes of indigenous recognition within the vexed US politics of race. Mestizaje names a political economy of indigenous extraction and appropriation. In addition to appropriating indigenous cultures for political nationalisms, mestizaje structures the labor market across the American hemisphere in ways that directly benefit the United States by cheapening the extraction of labor value from indigenous populations and by limiting indigenous peoples to subordinated segments of the labor market for racial capital. The lack of Spanish language fluency, for example, is a barrier to knowledge about labor rights, not only in Mexico, but in the United States. Entire communities of indigenous men and women have been recruited by labor contractors from their ejidos in Tlaxcala, Puebla, and Oaxaca to come and work as crop hands all over the country, including the Northeast. Half of the nation's crop hands are undocumented. Native American and indigenous, wrong page, that are undocumented according to the US Department of Agriculture's own statistics. There is nothing novel, especially here in California, in pointing out that our agricultural production depends on the hyper-exploited, undocumented labor force, for the cheap foodstuffs that we enjoy, even as the pandemic has allowed us to recognize this population as essential for racial capitalism. It is novel, however, that the percentage of indigenous undocumented immigrants has greatly increased as indigenous farmers were pushed off their communal farms by 1990s neoliberal reforms and by contemporary climate change. Indigenous people also find work in urban restaurants and grocery stores as part of the low-wage service economy that makes up the racial geography of our cities. Felipe Lopez and David Runston's research among Oaxacan, Mixtec, and Zapotec migrant workers highlights the role Mestizaje plays in segmenting the labor force, especially when we recognize Mestizaje as not only miscegenation, but as coerced acculturation to mestizo norms. They found that the lack of Spanish literacy was the determining factor in channeling Mixtec migrants into the hyper-exploitative agricultural sector in both Mexico and California, while Zapotec migrants, who were both Spanish literate and had worked in Oaxaca's tourist industry, found work in the less exploitative urban service sector. Even within these sectors, however, Lopez and Runston found discriminatory treatment and pay differentials between indigenous and mestizo workers on ranches and farms in Mexico and California. Meanwhile, Zapotecs who landed jobs in California restaurant kitchens found that speaking Zapotec created tensions between themselves and non-indigenous workers, causing Zapotecs to deny their ethnicity due to fear of discrimination from fellow Mexicans. Language barriers and ethnic shaming combine with undocumented status to create a hyper-exploitable indigenous class for racial capital. The militarization of the border ended interval migration, making indigenous Latin Americans a permanent part of the Latinx and Native American populations in the United States. Whereas before, the ease of crossing the border allowed undocumented immigrants to return to their families after work cycles, the militarization of the border encouraged immigrants to bring their families with them or raise new families here, staying indefinitely. Consequently, the Native American population in the United States grew by 21% in the 1990s. In California, the percentage of indigenous people grew by a whopping 146%. In the 2000 census, the number of Latinx who chose American Indian or Alaskan Native as their only ethnic or racial identification was just over 400,000 people. In 2010, that number increased to over 685,000 people. While this represents less than 1% of the 50 million people who identify as Latinx, it nevertheless represents a greater than 50% increase in Latinx people identifying as indigenous over the course of just 10 years. While the numbers for the 2020 census are still being analyzed, there was an 86.5% increase in the number of indigenous peoples living in the United States in the 2020 census, from 5.2 million in 2010 to 9.7 million in 2020. We still need to determine how much of that increase comes from Latin American indigenous immigrants, but I would venture to say that the lion's share of the increase is going to be accounted for in that way. The US Census allows a person to fill in the name of one's enrolled or principal tribe, but the word tribe, as we know, isn't used in Latin America. Thus, many people who identified as Native American left this blank. Nevertheless, those who did list a tribal affiliation put down Mayan, Zapotec, Mixtec, Triqui, and Purepeche, thus indicating that they are primarily from Guatemala and Mexico. It is here that we locate what escapes Mestizaje's extractive logic. As a discourse for producing national unity and managing indigenous life, Mestizaje necessarily provided the contradictory terms for indigenous inclusion. The Indian as origin story of Mestizaje provided Pan-American indigenous movements and peoples with the discursive possibility of claiming their pre-colonial belonging within the nation, even if this required a certain folklorization of their cultures. It is precisely this discursive possibility that Zapatistas seized upon in 1994 when they claimed Mexico for themselves with the slogan, Todos somos indios. If dead Indians were the folkloric origins of the Mexican nation, then living indigenous peoples have continuously decolonized this discursive ground by insisting on authoring their own and their nation's destiny. By claiming American Indian status on the census, a status not intended for them, These new indigenous immigrants stretched the meaning of the term Indian, imbuing it with unintended content mediated by mestizaje. By choosing American Indian, they unmoor their indigenous attachments to folkloric Mexico, Guatemala, or Peru, but also unmoor American Indian from its original bureaucratic intent. They have no recognition, tribal recognition, or affiliation from the US perspective. But they reiterate their indigenous priority, this time attaching it to US nationalism. By insisting on indigenous identity in the United States, they are claiming, I would argue, a prior continental belonging, a transcolonial belonging, if you will, that traverses the time and space of competing colonialities across the American landscape. This transcolonial indigenous priority as foundational form is mediated by mestizaje. I want to give one extended example, if the slides cooperate. I mean, I can give it without the slides, but it's much better with the slides. There we go. Thank you. From May through November every year, Zapotec and Mixtec communities in Santa Cruz, San Jose, Los Angeles, San Diego host Guelaguetza celebrations, and perhaps many of you have been to them. In Los Angeles, Guelaguetza events last an entire month, complete with a basketball tournament, a Miss Oaxaca beauty pageant, and an indigenous literature and film festival. These California Guelaguetzas reiterate the yearly Guelaguetza celebration in Oaxaca, an international tourist attraction responsible for a sizable chunk of the state's annual GDP. The principal event at the Oaxacan Guelaguetza is a seemingly endless day of dance performances representing the 16 indigenous peoples of Oaxaca. Each dance troupe performs the traditional dances from their regions in their trajes, their traditional, oh, can we go to the next? There we go. Their traditional indigenous trajes that you see here. These women are wearing 7 of the 16 patterns. At the end of each dance performance, the dancers customarily gift the particular product of their indigenous region, be that pineapples, chocolate, peanuts, gourds, by flinging these gifts into the audience. So you better duck or catch. The Oaxacan Guelaguetza is the textbook product of indigenista policies instituted by revolutionary mestizaje. Andres Enestrosa Morales, a Zapotec cultural critic and public intellectual, was himself a product of revolutionary indigenismo. Enestrosa explains in one of his many treatises on Zapotec culture that Guelaguetza is, quote, an erroneous transcription of the Zapotec word Guendaliza, meaning kinship and proximity, end quote. The suffix za in Zapotec means essence. Enestrosa continues, thus Guendaliza means this kinship and relationality that are the essence of Zapotec being. As a ritual of celebration and dance, of feasting, Guendaliza symbolizes belonging to community, but more specifically, the aid that each Zapotec offers other Zapotecs freely at moments of great importance, like birth, death, and marriage. Gift giving during Guendaliza is a representation of aid without the expectation of reciprocity. This mistranscription, this slippage from the Zapotec Guendaliza to the Spanish Guelaguetza, a slippage inherent in all translation, allows us to trace not simply a Zapotec history of colonization and survivance. It offers us another profound example of Zapotec transcolonial priority. Let me explain. The Aztecs first formalized the Guendaliza in honor of Centeotl, the Aztec goddess of corn, fixing the date of what were multiple Zapotec festivals to one day in July. The Aztecs strategically celebrated the Guendaliza atop Sierra del Fortín, where they had placed their garrison to maintain imperial control over the Oaxacan Valley with its Zapotec and Mixtec inhabitants. Today's Guelaguetza is still held in July atop Sierra del Fortín. Imperial Aztecs, in other words, grafted their celebration of Centeotl over Zapotec and Mixtec celebrations of multiple gods, including Cosijo, the god of rain, and Pitao Cocobi, the god of grain fields. When the Spaniards displaced the Aztecs as imperial overlords, they transformed the celebration of Centeotl into the celebration of the Virgen del Carmen. So it's the Aztec calendar of Zapotec and Mixtec celebration then that circuitously sets the date for Carmen's official saint's day in the Catholic calendar as July 16th. It's the old Spanish switcheroo atop an Aztec switcheroo. During the liberal 19th century, when elite Mexican Creoles reduced indigenous lands to less than 1% of the national territory, the Guelaguetza once again reverted to Zapotec and Mixtec communities, according to Henestrosa. It isn't until 1932 that the Guelaguetza was revived by the revolutionary state. It is then that the 16 traditional dances were added to official festivities. Moreover, it's at this point that the Guelaguetza gift-giving was explicitly linked to regional productivity in keeping with the revolutionary state's developmentalist agenda. In 1968, a beauty pageant for the title of Centeotl goddess is added to the festivities. And in 1974, the state government built an auditorium capable of seating tens of thousands of foreign and domestic tourists. When Zapotec and Mixtec communities host Guelaguetza celebrations in California, New Jersey, New York, they are reiterating Guendaliza as essence, as Zapotec and Mixtec community, kinship, aid, and obligation. The reiteration of Guendaliza is especially necessary in the United States as it makes sheer survival possible. The Guelaguetza, however, is a reiteration of the revolutionary Mestizaje indigenismo dyad in the United States. It is the public performance of a particular kind of indigenous folkloric tradition in the interest of establishing indigenous continental priority, which is in turn invoked to create inclusion within US nationalism, yet another iteration of colonial geography. I am not suggesting that Guendaliza would not exist if not for revolutionary Mestizaje, but the meaning of the Guelaguetza exists in the aftermath of revolutionary Mestizaje, which enables the claiming of transcolonial indigenous priority. Guendaliza establishes communal ties and communities. The public Guelaguetza celebrations claim California, New York, New Jersey for Zapotec and Mixtec peoples. These celebrations are an example of Mestizaje desde abajo, of challenging and stretching the terms of revolutionary Mestizaje from the imposition of indigenous priority. The Oaxacan Guelaguetza showcases indigenous peoples performing their symbolic origin of the nation through folkloric dances and their elaborate hand-woven embroidered trajes. However, it also showcases the literal fruits of indigenous labor, their agricultural production of the national diet. Piña, elote, chocolate, cacahuates, chayote, camote, tomate, aguacate. What do all these foods have in common? The ote and ate suffixes point us towards an answer, as they indicate Nahuatl words that transform the Spanish language through linguistic mestizaje. They are foodstuffs developed by indigenous agricultural technology in the Mesoamerican cradle of civilization. The foodstuffs of every Mexican's diet and of all of ours, probably in the US as well. Oh, also vanilla, that's very important. Mestizaje's extractive and appropriative logic thus reveals how the shared culture we call mestizo in Latin America is profoundly indigenous. As Simón Trujillo and I argue elsewhere, mestizaje misnames a shared culture as mestizo when it is in fact largely based on indigenous knowledge production, foodways, cosmologies, medicine, ethics, modes of speech and address, modes of agricultural production, the engineering of biodiversity, because Mesoamerican biodiversity is a feat of indigenous engineering. The very Spanish vocabularies we use today vary widely, depending on the specific indigenous languages spoken and indigenous knowledges developed in the indigenous geographies claimed today by nation states. What one calls a tamal, never mind what's in it, or an aguacate depends entirely on whether Quechua and Aymara and Mapuche hybridized Spanish in the Andes, or Nahuatl and Maya hybridized Spanish in Mesoamerica. So much of what we call mestizo in the Americas today is thoroughly indigenous. Such a material and epistemic debt requires us to re-examine the nature and politics of indigenous elimination under models of white settler colonialism. Mestizaje challenges the Anglophone settler colonial model of destruction and replacement because in Latin America, mestizaje enabled the inclusion and mining of indigenous knowledge production, even as indigenous peoples themselves were devalued. Mestizaje names a set of specific alternatives to settler dominance that, however paradoxically, created a space for the epistemic vitality of indigenous peoples who transgress the enclosures of mestizo hybridity. If mestizaje puts indigenous knowledge production under erasure in the service of mestizo nationalism, then decolonizing mestizaje entails first and foremost a distinct politics of knowledge, especially Latinx knowledge production. It requires new methodologies that would allow scholars to reevaluate the archives, texts, monuments, institutions, and memories of colonial modernity for indigenous content. I return to methodology at the end of my talk. For now, I suggest that this is not so much a romantic project of indigenous retrieval as an epistemic attribution of intellectual property rights. Decolonizing mestizaje, as I argue elsewhere, entails recognizing that modernity is not the exclusive product of mestizo or white supremacy. Benedict Anderson convincingly argued that the nation-state form originated in the Americas, in which case the abstractions of democracy and equality are necessarily a product of European encounter with indigenous cultures and governmentalities, as well as with indigenous freedom movements that it participated in independence from Spain, as Silvia Rivera Cusicanti has argued. Similarly, Nicole Edson Delgado shows in her forthcoming manuscript the way Yaqui activists and intellectuals provided modes of participatory democracy and communalism for the Mexican Revolutionary Project early in the 20th century. Once we relinquish the concept of mestizaje as an enactment of liberatory racial hybridity, we must then forge the difficult work of interrogating mestizaje for its indigenous content as a problem of knowledge under the duress of what Trujillo has called colonial epistemicide. Decolonizing indigenous knowledge production, mestizaje desde abajo, must be a priority for 21st century Latinx studies. It falls to us because we are the gatekeepers of what because we are the gatekeeper of what gets defined as Latinx knowledge, and because we stand in unique relationship to indigenous ancestry. Mestizaje named and continues to name what is missing for Chicanx and other biracial Latinx subjects subjected to a US racial jurisprudence that privileges hypodescent. More than 100 years of US laws and court decisions required Mexicans to emphatically renounce any and all indigenous and African heritage. The forms of limited enfranchisement available for Mexicans legally required this disassociation, regardless of kinship ties. What's more, indigenous pueblos recognized as such by the US were similarly required to sever ties with their mestizo family members in order to be properly Indian and maintain their lands in reservation status. The gravity of this historical loss of indigeneity, of its psychic toll, cannot simply be discounted or dismissed. The influx of indigenous migrants over the last 30 years, however, alerts me to another consequence of the US racial order of hypodescent that I did not consider when I wrote Who's the Indian in Aztlan? A significant percentage of the millions of Mexican immigrants to the United States over the last century were indigenous, not mestizo. Most of these indigenous immigrants inevitably gave up their indigenous attachments to become just plain Mexican under the cultural and legal duress of US hypodescent rules and racial citizenship. When I critiqued Mestizaje for the romanticized access it gave Chicanos to a long-lost indigenous ancestry, I didn't recognize that for many, this indigenous ancestry was no more than one generation removed. It was specific and geographically rooted. It was repressed or folklored or foreclosed. It is uncanny, unmourned, and ungrieved. The loss of indigeneity, then, is not an event, it's a structure, an ongoing structure well beyond the psyche of the Chicanx population, as Trujillo and I argued in another publication. It isn't consigned to the past. Indigenous migrants to the United States from Mexico, Central America, the Andes, are continuously coerced into losing connections to kin and land because nothing in US legal codes or racial formation allows them to claim their indigenous identity. These indigenous peoples do not conform to the narrow rules of US Native American recognition. As a consequence, I asked, will Generation 3.0 of Zapotec, Mixtec, Triqui, etc. immigrants to the United States cease to be indigenous and fall under the generic category of mestizo Mexican through a lack of recognition in US terms? Will this be yet another iteration of the appropriative story of cultural mestizaje? Or can we colonize mestizaje as an avenue for naming different modalities of indigenous specificity? As a possible answer to these questions, I close with another example of, oh shoot, too far. Can I go back one? Oh, no, hold on. It's very tricky. There we go. I close with another example of mestizaje desde abajo. In 2018, the Los Angeles Public Library hosted an exhibit titled Visualizing Language, Oaxaca in LA, part of the Pacific Standard Time's sprawling LA exposition. The muralist, the Tlacolulocos, a Zapotec collective from Tlacolula, Oaxaca, where Zapotecs make up more than 50% of the population, almost all of them with relatives in Los Angeles. The Tlacolulocos are from Tlacolula. The murals commemorate the continuing kinship and proximity between Zapotecs in Tlacolula and in Los Angeles. They sit below, as you can see at the top, they sit below Dean Cromwell's permanent 1933 murals, The Four Great Eras of California, celebrating the Anglo settlers' conquest of California. As cultural critic Catherine Ramirez summarizes, these murals, quote, the murals by the Tlacolulocos, dispel the myth that indigenous people are tethered to the past and to a single place, bringing into focus Oaxaca, California, end quote. In a mestizaje desde abajo, a visual aesthetics, these murals marry the traditional Zapotec trajes, embroidery, and jewelry and architectural grecas that we see tattooed on one of the girls' faces with the Chicanx style. Graffiti fonts, tattoos, the gang sign for Los Angeles West Side, which is now a Oaxacan neighborhood. Ramirez argues that the murals challenge Cornwall's representation of the California fantasy of Spanish colonialism as a bunch of docile Indians, selfless priests, and beautiful senoritas who graciously accepted the triumph of Anglo-Protestant industry. This is made evident in the image of the conquistador's helmet, which we see right here, shot through with indigenous arrows, one of which affixes the image of Toy Purina, a Tongva medicine woman who led a revolt against the San Gabriel mission. This image, Ramirez suggests, is a recognition of, quote, kuleana, the responsibility, authority, and right indigenous immigrants have to other peoples and the occupied lands they live on and work on, end quote. Ramirez does not elaborate. However, I took her to mean that the inclusion of Toy Purina by the Tlacolulocos was a visual land acknowledgement, a way of asking the Tongva for permission to be in Los Angeles. Instead, Ramirez, a brilliant cultural critic, immediately does a 180-degree turn, suggesting the incorporation of this portrait is another form of indigenismo, a celebration of, quote, past and distant Indians rather than reckoning with the present and proximate indigenous peoples, end quote. Once again, I came face to face in print with the afterlife of my critique, almost word for word from Who's the Indian in Aztlán, refracted through the white settler colonial paradigm. 20 years later, it's no longer Mestizaje that is displacing living Indians, but the critique of Mestizaje and indigenismo that is being put to use to eliminate proximate living Indians, Zapotecs, Los Angelinos, by rendering them as always already geographically alien. Ramirez concludes that the Tlacolu Locos and the LA Zapotecos who invited them were perpetuating, quote, contemporary settler logics, end quote, because they were ultimately assimilating Zapotecos into a US multiculturalism as just another group of migrants at the expense of the Tongva. The fact that the murals were commissioned by the Los Angeles Public Library in conjunction with the Getty Foundation solidifies this for Ramirez as, quote, the commission unfolded indigenous Oaxacans into Los Angeles' heterogeneous population and transformed them from Aravans, people forced into settler society through the violence of European and Anglo-American global expansion, into immigrants, newcomers whose contributions to society are recognized and valued. In short, Baja Californios were assimilated, end quote. To be fair, Ramirez is arguing that the commission does this to Baja Californios. But Zapotecs are nevertheless complicit, as she concludes by agreeing with Lourdes Gutierrez Najera and Corinta Maldonado's assessment that, quote, indigenous Mexicans are not exempt from perpetuating contemporary settler logics, end quote. Why are we compelling Zapotec and Mixtec Angelinos into the white settler colonial paradigm? When doing so, reifies national boundaries set by imperialist countries and confirms their racial geographies. Instead, I suggest that we read these murals as a public expression of indigenous transcolonial priority and mestizaje desde abajo. This panel is once again citing the mixture of Mesoamerican and Chicanx motifs with the traditional traje pants, huaraches, and machete on the one hand, and with the teardrop spider and dollar tattoos on the other. This young Zapotecan is getting La Pinta, La Niña, and La Santa Maria tattooed onto his chest with clouds shaped like the dialogue boxes you find on Mesoamerican codexes, suggesting that even in the face of this colonial embodiment, this act of colonial embodiment of wearing colonial history on the skin, he is mediating this with his own indigenous authorial voice, and that these murals are a contemporary codex resignifying that past. He makes this history of colonial coercion, of church and state, which you see represented by the priest, of church and state blocking the sun, and I lost my place. Yes, here we go. Hiding the sun of indigenous knowledge formation, his own. The Zapotec traveler tucks this colonial history under his arm as he creates this hybrid geography of Tlacolu LA, insisting indigenous migrants never forget the priority of their transcolonial belonging. It is we, the viewers, who must remember that this world, the American continent, has always been theirs, not ours. The Tlacolu Locos use what Jennifer Ponce de Leon has theorized as extradisciplinary aesthetics. They combine various aesthetic genres with disciplinary knowledge to produce art that challenges the boundaries of both. The Tlacolu Locos not only blend the visual with the literary, the panoply of Zapotec, Spanish, and English phrases that punctuate these images, as we see here, they also incorporate and decolonize historiography, revising the Colombian saga from an indigenous perspective. Similarly, in this mural detail, they meld the distinctive Day of the Dead aesthetics on the young girl's arm, itself emblematic of indigenous cosmovisions, with the philosophical and political disciplinary knowledge upon which she sits. Vasconcelos' Raza Cósmica has been resignified as Mestizaje desde abajo with the help of Foucault, whose understanding of biopower Zapotecs have thoroughly incorporated as easily as they incorporated the Western musical instrument like the one she is playing. Meanwhile, the Zapotec political economy of communalism, Guelaguetza, borrows from and completes Buchanan's unfinished treatise, Dios y el Estado on Anarchy. The Tacolu Locos inscribed their mural with extradisciplinary knowledge to disrupt modernist distinctions between aesthetics, philosophy, and history, because for indigenous cosmovisions, such divisions are not only non-existent, they threaten plant life on a planetary scale. To decolonize our Latinx knowledge production, we too need to get extradisciplinary. The tools of textual or visual analysis alone cannot analyze indigenous cultural production. Analyzing these murals requires linguistic expertise capable and willing to read across Zapotec, Spanish, and English language systems. It also requires ethnohistory, anthropology, and sociology to properly understand the millennial history of overlapping indigenous geographies of emplotment and movement, of pre-colonial belonging, as well as to comprehend the human-made consequences of contemporary displacement. When will we stop calling the last 3 decades of indigenous movement from south to north a crisis and recognize it as a hemispheric remapping of the American continent by indigenous pueblos as a means of survivance and transcolonial belonging? Decolonizing knowledge production doesn't just require interdisciplinary method, however, because indigenous knowledge systems are extradisciplinary. Their philosophies, aesthetics, and science exist outside of our Western systems and categories of knowing, even as they hide in plain sight behind the mask of Mestizaje. Indigenous bioengineering, for example, challenges the very division between science and religion upon which Western knowledge systems are based, and includes a method upon which Western epistemes are founded. Thus, a Latinx methodology for decolonizing Western knowledge systems includes the method of letting go of power, of letting go of the subject presumed to know. The title of the mural series, Visualizing Language, directs the critic to the extradisciplinary mode of apprehension and comprehension, as each individual mural also has a title, appearing in Zapotec or Spanish within the murals themselves. Together, these titles form a prayer, a poem for the indigenous traveler, who emphatically is not an immigrant or an arrivant. For the pride of your hometown, take the path of the elders in memory of the forgotten ones. Smile now, cry later. Remember, the world is mine, wherever you go. The size of your suffering, that is how they hide the sun. The angels sing and give praise to God. Extradisciplinary aesthetics dictate the poem should be read in tandem with the murals. But in the interest of time, I will do a simple literary reading. The paths north that indigenous people take today were already mapped by pre-Columbian elders millennia ago. These early travelers and their paths may have been forgotten, but these new pathfinders walk in their memory to join their Latinx brethren in Los Angeles, as suggested by the Chicanismo, smile now, cry later. An imperative to live in the present joyfully, but to also hide your pain from European settlers to this continent who will block the sun with your suffering if you let them. But don't let them, for the angels of Los Angeles protect the traveler, singing praise to the Christian God indigenous people have made entirely their own. For this reading, I rely on the work of yet another former advisee, Leticia Alvarado, who theorizes abjection, so often projected on the generic Mexican immigrant, as an occasion for anti-colonial reinscription. The Tlacolu Locos transform indigenous abjection into belonging through extradisciplinary aesthetics that implot indigenous travelers in the United States through a boldly asserted, heavily footnoted transcolonial priority. Thank you. And I got it under 45 minutes. Should I just handle, well, I can't handle the Q&A from the virtual realm.